Washington, D.C. Today in Book Talk, we have Nigel Inkster with us with his book, The Great Decoupling, China, America, and the Struggle for Technological Supremacy. Nigel Inkster is Senior Advisor at International Institute for Strategic Studies and a Director of Geopolitical and Intelligence Analysis at Enodo Economics, prior to which he worked in the British government dealing with foreign policy and security issues. He is the author of China's Cyber Power. And today we will discuss the China-US relations in the context of technology. And this is actually an extremely timely book. And I will ask Nigel actually to tell the story of the book in a minute, but considering the US relations with China and considering increasing emphasis on technology, both in interim strategic national security strategic guidance and worldwide threat assessment report by don't have much idea, but apparently it is something extremely significant. And of course, the 5G technologies. In the previous administration, we heard about things like cyber warfare, cyber attacks. But now in the last 3 months, we have been exposed to a lot of technological concepts. And each and every time the administration is talking about China, they make sure that it is not only an intelligence, political, and economic threat, it is also a technological threat, competitor, or adversary, whatever you want to use. Nigel, please tell us the story of this book.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to talk to your members today. As you mentioned, this is not the first book on Chinese technology that I've written. In 2016, I produced a book called China's Cyber Power, which looked at that particular area of technology. I hadn't really planned to produce anything after that, but I was actually approached by the publisher to do something. And by that point, as you mentioned, a lot of things had moved on. It was already apparent when I wrote my first book that relations between China and the USA, which had always been more fragile than sometimes was acknowledged, had deteriorated quite dramatically. I remember noting this at the beginning of 2018 when I came to the USA to attend a seminar at the US Naval War College, and it was clear to me then that something quite fundamental had changed in the US policy community in relation to China, and that was kind of the beginning of a significant downward shift in relations that has taken, I would argue, the US-China relationship to its lowest level since before the Nixon rapprochement in 1972. And technology writ large has played a very big role in all of this. And that being the case, my experience has always been in these situations. They invite a lot of polemic, not all of it particularly well informed. So I thought that one of the important things that this book should try to do was to set what China is currently embarked upon in the broader historical and cultural context of China as this rather unique civilization. So the early chapters are devoted to China's own indigenous intellectual traditions, which include science and technology. And in particular, a reminder to readers that China was responsible for probably half of all the world's engineering inventions, including the ones that made possible the Western-led age of exploration in the 16th century. But for all its technological ingenuity, which is very extensive, and I give plentiful examples in the book, I think that it's true to say that China never succeeded in developing a real culture of science. And this, as defined by Professor Joseph Needham, who wrote a multi-volume history of China's science and technology, was defined by him as the application of mathematical hypotheses to nature, the full understanding and use of experimental method, the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, the geometrization of space, and the acceptance of a mechanical model of reality. To that, I would add a point made by my former tutor at Oxford University, Dr. Mark Elvin, who wrote a very brilliant ecological history of China, on which I drew, which was essentially that the Chinese never developed the concept of a fact as a kind of publicly accessible approximation of reality that could be subject to change and evolution in the light of experience, and which was kind of broadly accepted. That kind of never happened. Anyway, the bottom line in all of this was that although in the late 18th, early 19th century, China was a very consequential global civilization, and as a country was well administered and prosperous, it was also highly vulnerable in the face of Western nations equipped with superior capabilities due to the Industrial Revolution. So when the West came knocking on China's door in the early 19th century, looking to greatly increase trade, China took the view that the world was divided into two. One was the Sinosphere, which was civilized, and the rest, which was basically barbarians, and these included the Westerners. And in many respects, the Westerners kind of earned China's assessment as being very uncouth and uncivilized, but they had modern warships, modern artillery, breech-loading firearms for which China was no match. And so essentially overnight, China went from being a huge civilization, a long and ancient and major civilization that saw itself as literally the center of the world. The name China, Zhongguo, means literally the center of the world. It went overnight from being kind of hero to zero, disparaged and decried in Western media as an irremediably backward, superstitious place that was kind of ripe for the plucking, and which over the course of the 19th century was turned into a kind of semi-colonial possession of the Western powers, with over 40 so-called concessions, areas of territory, which were occupied by and administered by Western countries, and in which Chinese were second-class citizens. And all of this sparked a kind of major crisis of identity, and the search for a modern identity with a distinctly Chinese civilizational character, which has driven pretty much everything China has done ever since, and is very much at the heart of what China is trying to do now. And unless people understand this background, it's going to be very difficult to make sense of what China is doing and why. Why is it that China feels this burning need to to use the Chinese word "ganchao," catch up with and surpass the West. And this has really been what China's been trying to do, as I said, ever since the West kicked its door in. I mean, at the outset, the response of China's intelligentsia was predictably diverse. Some people argued for a doubling down on traditional Chinese culture. Others sought a kind of hybrid model. Others advocated for a wholesale rejection of Chinese civilization and an embrace of Western modernity. And these intellectual trends have continued to play out in China today. If we look at the kind of ideology that Beijing currently espouses. China's efforts to modernize were complicated and prolonged by some very difficult geopolitics. And when the People's Republic of China was finally established in 1949, following a 4-year civil war, the country was pretty much on its knees and was then plunged into a succession of political movements because under Mao Zedong, class struggle was the main priority. And to use Mao's own terms, redness was preferred over expertise. Educated people, scientists in particular, were distrusted and disparaged, a trend which reached its apogee during this 10-year period, the Cultural Revolution, which was a kind of collective national nervous breakdown. And emblematic of the attitude prevailing during that period was the fact that Albert Einstein was the subject of political struggle sessions in China because his theory of relativity contradicted a completely unscientific communist assessment of a universe that was infinite and steady state. And actually, if you read the Three-Body Problem, this Chinese trilogy of science fiction, you will actually see this depicted in very graphic terms in the first volume of that trilogy, the struggle against Einsteinian physics. Anyway, when China finally came blinking out into the daylight in the late 1970s, the key imperative was to make up for lost time, and the focus was unremittingly on economic development. And in this context, China was very lucky, incredibly lucky, because you had a large and actually quite well-educated population, notwithstanding all the Maoist madness, that was highly aspirational, that was just ready to take advantage of any opportunities that presented themselves. And of course, as the Cold War came to an end in the late 1980s, early 90s, this opened the floodgates to a globalization process that had been in the deep freeze essentially since the First World War. And China was uniquely positioned to take advantage of that. But the recognition, even though China at that point was operating on a very, very technically low base, China's leaders were acutely aware of the role that modern technologies and information communications technologies in particular would play in China's economic development. Although back then there were no computers and hardly any phone lines, thanks to the writings of the American futurologist Alvin Toffler, China's leaders were acutely aware of what they needed to do. And when the ability to do so presented itself, they moved very fast. And what we saw in China was an intriguing combination of a series of top-down government-led initiatives to promote the emergence of technology, plus the creation of a highly permissive and cutthroat competition between emerging Chinese private sector companies, which the Taiwanese entrepreneur Kylie Fu describes, very comprehensively in his book, the title of which, of course, I conveniently forget at the moment. It's easy to find. And this was, created a remarkable transformation. There were huge risks for China, particularly with the internet. They were heavily reliant, almost exclusively reliant to start with, on US technology, both hardware and software. And they were acutely aware of the potential of the internet to act as a vector for subversion, the information that would undermine the Chinese Communist Party dominant narrative. Notwithstanding an awareness of those risks, they moved ahead, and initially we saw, we saw the emergence of a very close interdependence between the USA and China in the technology area. China was the ideal location for the lower end manufacture of ICT products. They had the workforce and the market conditions, but also, of course, China increasingly and very rapidly became an attractive market in its own right as indigenous Chinese capabilities, indigenous Chinese companies developed an ambitious and very effective suite of capabilities in terms of e-commerce, e-finance, et cetera, that were eagerly seized upon by the population as a whole, and particularly once the smartphone came into the equation. Of course, most of these smartphones were being manufactured in China, even though the design and the IP was closely held back in the United States. The extent of the entanglement, if you like, between the US and China is evidenced from the fact that for many years, Microsoft Windows XP was the kind of default IT system for use in all Chinese government departments. And when the company decided that they were no longer going to support Windows XP, they had to think again and make an exception for China, because not to have done so would have had such major implications for the country. But as China's own capabilities grew, so too did its growing discomfort with a reliance on American technology, particularly after the 2012 Snowden revelations. And so China, by that stage, had already evolved this concept of cyber sovereignty, the idea that that countries should have an internationally recognized right to police content transiting their sovereign space. And it was also starting to promote indigenous manufacture. And at this point, I think we began to see evidence of real strain in the US-China relationship in relation to technology, particularly with the promulgation of programs such as Made in China 2025, which sought to ensure that by that date, 70% of strategically relevant products in the IT sector were manufactured within China. I now come to China's the the parting of the ways, if you like, between the US and China. And here there are three key dates. The first was 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization on developing country terms. And this development turbocharged China's economic development, really transformational. But the decision to allow China, such a large economy, to join on developing country terms, which in many ways made perfect sense, also proved to have some very significant complications, which are now becoming apparent. The second key date, I would argue, is 2008, the global financial crisis. China was at least as responsible for this as profligate and irresponsible US bankers, no question about that, precisely because the way it had played its membership of the World Trade Organization with very, very selective opening and keeping a lot of factors in its favor, and also developing a huge savings glut, which ultimately became unsustainable and led to the crisis that we've become familiar with. For China, this was a moment of epiphany. They had thought that the USA would be more competent than this, would have anticipated the risks and done more to prevent them. And the Chinese government, which was hit very hard by this crisis, determined that they were never again going to allow themselves to be put in this position. And then the third key date, I would argue, is 2012, which was the date on which Xi Jinping was elected to be the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, together with the presidency and the chairman of the Central Military Commission. And although initially it was unclear what sort of leader Xi Jinping would be, he wasn't particularly well known, even within China. I don't think people really understood, who this person really was. It rapidly became clear that he had an ambitious agenda for China that went far beyond the kind of low-key status quo power that China had been for the preceding 20 plus years. We heard about the concept of the China dream, and shortly thereafter, Xi Jinping's concept of the community of common destiny, which was a kind of Chinese alternative to the so-called rules-based order established by the United States and allies after World War II, and which is, I would argue, I do argue in the book, is a recipe for kind of Chinese-led world order, but with rather different characteristics from that of the British in the 19th and America in the 20th century, and we can talk more about that. But technology has also, played an important role in turning China into a major global intelligence power, something that I address in the book, in which I argue that the scale and extent of China's intelligence operations now, largely enabled by modern technology, is becoming a strategic phenomenon in its own right, and needs to be looked at, in a different way from how espionage has been traditionally looked at. And by the same token, in the book, I also look at the way in which China has become what I would call a techno-security state, the way in which it is using a suite of technologies, monitoring of online communications, pervasive use of video cameras linked to artificial intelligence systems, able to undertake facial gait recognition, not just within China, although there, is where we see it, sort of most prominently, including in Xinjiang, where it, which has served as a test bed for many of these technologies, but increasingly in terms of China's efforts to exercise control over the Chinese narrative beyond China's borders. And that is something the book also looks at. I don't think anybody, even China's leadership, expected China to get as far and as fast as it has. And this has undoubtedly created a lot of concern within the United States and in the Western liberal democracies more broadly. And we saw this in terms of the Donald Trump initiated trade war in 2018, which rapidly transformed or extended rather into a technology war, the primary purpose of which appeared to be to constrain China's own technology ambitions and to create a breathing space for the United States to catch up in areas such as fifth generation mobile technology, where it hadn't really lagged behind because most of the fundamental technologies to do with 5G were American. But where the USA had fallen behind was in its lack of ability to manufacture key components of 5G systems, such that no US company was able to put together an end-to-end 5G system, which effectively left the field open for China to make a bid to become globally dominant in this technology. And we're now seeing China making a similar bid to achieve control of global standards in a range of technologies in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, et cetera, because of course China is acutely aware that given its size and the scale on which it is able to operate, no other country would be able to compete with Chinese commercialization of these new technologies once they achieve maturity. So the key question, two key questions, and I'll end after this because I'm running towards the end of my allotted time. Firstly, who's on top when it comes to technology? Where are the respective strengths and weaknesses of the two different systems? And it's very difficult to tell, not least because China tends to oscillate between periods of what I would characterize as techno-exuberance and periods when they are at pains to downplay the extent of their achievements vis-a-vis the West. But broadly speaking, I would say that where China has excelled to date has been in the ingenious application of and development of existing technologies that they themselves did not create. And actually, when you look at the history of technology, this is not a secondary or trivial consideration. A lot of the important developments in technology come in the form of incremental improvements once the fundamental technology breakthrough has been achieved. But it is the case that China is still very weak on foundational science relative to the West. I mean, China has virtually no Nobel Prize winners, and he's got one actually in the hard sciences, and that's a lady who made some discoveries in relation to malaria quite a long time ago. And this is something that a lot of commentators in China remark on. There's this lack of strength in foundational science. The other advantages China has got, I would say, are twofold. One is this very, very focused and concentrated state effort to develop a leading position in key technologies involving enormous financial incentives and other incentives to entrepreneurs to take risks in developing these technologies. And the other one, of course, which is particularly pertinent in relation to artificial intelligence, is the huge volumes of data that China is able to generate, which, taken together with the huge volumes of Western data that China is currently in the process of stealing, potentially give it quite an important edge in areas like artificial intelligence and other areas such as biotechnology. So what's happening now? And this brings me to the title of the book and my kind of final point, The Great Decoupling. Is this a thing? Well, if I didn't think it was a thing, I wouldn't have called my book by that title. I don't think it clearly is. And we're seeing now a move by Western governments, at least, to try to disentangle some of the very, very tight connectivity with China that has emerged over the years. In the case of America, they're not always, what the government and what Congress wants and what the private sector, in particular Silicon Valley, wants are two different things, because there are many in Silicon Valley who are heavily invested in continued engagement and collaboration with China and very reluctant to accept any need to decouple, either because they're making lots of money out of the Chinese market or because they are still genuinely imbued with the original ideals that attended the development of the internet. I mean, some in Silicon Valley, Eric Schmidt, for a case in point, has begun to accept the need to recognize the shifting strategic tectonic plates and is arguing for some selective decoupling from China. Other respected academics, Aaron Friedberg, a case in point, has made similar arguments. It is happening. It's not happening in a planned way. It's not easy to identify where this is going to end. And I suspect it probably doesn't ever really have an endpoint. It's going to be very, very messy. But if decoupling does gather momentum, then I think that there are sort of serious implications for the world more generally, in terms of what I anticipate as being a general diminution in creativity and the generation of new ideas and new technologies, and also a reinforcing of ideological divisions and distrust, if, as could potentially happen, we end up with a world that is divided between a sinosphere and a sphere dominated and controlled by the USA and like-minded countries, with a lot of third countries placed in an unenviable position of maybe having to choose between one or the other, or operating both systems with all the additional costs and complexity that entails. I'll leave it there because I more or less used up my allotted time. I've skated very fast over a lot of thin ice, and I'm sure that people will want to investigate more deeply a lot of the areas that I've covered, inevitably in a very superficial way, but which the book goes into in a lot more detail. So please read the book.
Exactly. Thank you, Nigel. And I have some questions, and those of our audience on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and on Zoom. On Zoom, if you want to ask question, please write your question to Q&A box. And if you are following us through Twitter, please write your question through comments so that my assistants can collect those questions and give it to me. And
Mhm.
my question, Nigel, I have a set of questions actually. The first one is, isn't this one of those moments that the US had lived before? So like
Mhm.
just like Sputnik moment that you talk about in
Yeah.
1960s, and just like 1980s when there was this concern about rising Japanese technology. Even there was, I remember Michael Crichton has this novel called Rising Sun, in
Yes.
which there was this competition between Japan and United States on
Yeah.
the control of international electronics industry. Do
Mhm.
you think we are living, like again, one of those times? And do you think in both instances, the alarmism after Sputnik, for example, was the decline of the US? And we had similar debates in 1980s when Japan was writing about the decline of the US and this Japanese threat. Are we living the same moment? And do you think some people
Mhm.
are overreacting to Chinese technological developments?
So to the last part of your question, I think the answer is yes, very much so. I mean, we're seeing now, a lot of books being written by people with not a lot of background, in presenting this situation in kind of very alarmist terms. And I tend to think that it probably won't be that bad. But there are a couple of factors that that potentially make it different. Firstly, we have, let's just say that the Chinese communists, being of necessity historical determinists, have concluded that the West, the USA, and the West more generally, is in terminal decline, and that the tide of history is now flowing in China's direction. You see a lot of articles now in Chinese language intellectual circles that tend to begin with the words, the East is rising, the West is declining, or words to that effect. There are those within China's intelligentsia who are aware of US capacity for self-renewal and regeneration, which, to cite the examples you just mentioned, has been evidenced before. So, one should not lose sight of the fact that the United States has very strong incumbent advantages in terms of the technologies that we are talking about. But it also does have some vulnerabilities which need to be addressed. And these have been seized upon, certainly by the Biden administration. I know people like Jake Sullivan, who I've heard talking on these issues, is acutely aware of the importance for the USA of things like developing the country's human capital on a more systematic basis, working to ensure that the country's basic infrastructure is kind of up to speed. And we see a lot of work being done in Congress now to address all of this. But the thing about China is that everything to do with China is that its size makes it different. Japan in the 1980s, yes, was a commercial competitor for the United States, but at the same time, it was also very much under the U.S. security umbrella, and was not a strategic actor in the defense and security spaces. China is. China's military modernization and intelligence modernization have been hugely driven by technology, to the point where militarily China has to be taken seriously as a peer competitor with the United States. Now, what that means in practice is hard to know. An optimistic reading of this situation is that both countries will recognize that their respective military capabilities effectively cancel each other out. Nobody can be, can hope to be militarily dominant, or that, the costs of warfare are so great that it is, simply not a rational option to pursue. Against that, I would say we've been here before, World War One, Norman Angell, who argued that war between Britain and Imperial Germany was unthinkable because of the economic damage it would cause. Well, yeah, we know how that ended. Also because I've not been a particular proponent of the Thucydides trap, Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, but Thucydides did make the point in his Peloponnesian Wars that the drivers of warfare are fear, honor, and advantage. Phobos ke timis ke ophilos. There are plenty of reasons to be concerned that a contest between China and the United States for global dominance has the potential to turn kinetic, and that to me is a real worry that we have to be alert to.
Thank you, Nigel. And I have some other questions, but I started to ask some of the audience questions. I have a long question about the surveillance technologies and the export of surveillance technologies by China to other countries. The question is, do you think Beijing attempts to spread its own form of regime to other parts of the world, or do you think it is mostly an economic enterprise?
Yeah, well, I think the answer is it's both. It's certainly done for economic purposes, but it also has a broader geostrategic purpose, and that by providing a lot of countries, particularly in the developing world, with Chinese systems, whatever these may be. Firstly, obviously, this provides China with espionage opportunities, but also it provides China with political leverage. And also it's seen within the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, this huge plan that China has to create land, sea, and air networks linking the rest of the planet to Chinese markets, that providing states that are key players in the Belt and Road Initiative with Chinese systems, including all the surveillance capabilities that come with those, potentially enables China to have the Belt and Road kind of policed on the cheap. China's looked at the US model of global hegemony, 800 military bases dotted around the globe. No, thank you, we don't want that. They've looked at the British model, colonies all over the place, very expensive and carry enormous vulnerabilities, don't want to go there either. So I think what they're looking at is a system where essentially China, to the extent possible, can subcontract to the relevant states the responsibility for securing the Belt and Road. Also, of course, just as happened with the British in the 19th century, when the world was wired for telegraphy by the British company Cable and Wireless, and by the USA in the 20th century with the internet, providing these technologies does offer all sorts of advantages, both tangible and more intangible to the country that is providing them.
And my question is about the Biden administration, and you reminded Jake Sullivan and his interest actually to these issues. And Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the first time that United States has had now Deputy National Security Advisor for cyber and emerging technologies.
Yes.
And my question is, in your book, you mentioned that US has no strategy for decoupling, although there was a trade war, and trade war is mostly, down Trump's period, trade war was mostly, I guess, about the trade surplus and trade deficit and how to sell more than we buy from China. So the question, do you find the President Biden's investment to infrastructure, his plan to invest infrastructure, and his policy so far, of course, it has been only 100 days now, sufficient to deal with China's technological challenge?
Well, that's a very good question, and one that's extremely difficult to answer. I mean, you're absolutely right. Donald Trump's trade war had an important effect in, so to speak, calling a halt to China's ability to play the international system without being called to account. Trump's activities did have have that effect, and it's noteworthy that the Biden administration has not sought yet to reverse any of the major initiatives in relation to China that Trump took. But Trump's trade war, I don't think really achieved succeeded in its own terms, in that it didn't reduce the trade deficit, it didn't bring back manufacture to the United States, and it didn't actually, in many cases, benefit the U.S. Agricultural sector. And essentially, I think what Biden is doing is I think a continuation of the Trump agenda of getting tough on China's perceived infractions, but also but within the context of a more, shall we say, coherent strategic concept, recognizing that the USA can't do this alone. It's got to work in conjunction with partners, focusing on addressing the US vulnerabilities that China itself has been so adept at exploiting. Now, whether this is in itself going to be enough to achieve objectives which haven't really been, I would argue, that well articulated, remains to be seen. And my concern here is less about the technology. It's less about investment. I think my concern is more about, has the Trump administration actually recognized the extent to which global power has been diffused to the point where Biden's aspirations for the USA to resume its traditional leadership role may no longer prove to be realistic. I think that, to my mind, is the bigger question. The money's there if they choose to use it. The technology's there if they choose to develop it. But I think I suspect that the geopolitics have shifted in ways that may not yet have fully been appreciated by those in charge of the Biden administration.
Thank you very much. And there are two questions. I want to connect those questions together. Long questions, but I will try to summarize them. One of them is Biden and his foreign policy team keep talking about rebuilding alliances or strengthening alliances. Do you think strengthening alliances can work in technology as well? And the second question was somewhat related. Because of that, I want to add it. Where does Japan and South Korea stand in this competition?
Yes. Well, both these questions, I think, essentially go to the point that I just made, that I'm not sure that the conditions necessarily exist for the USA to resume its traditional leadership role in the way that we have come to be familiar with. And technology, I think, is an interesting case here. We saw in 2020 the US government put enormous pressure on the United Kingdom to exclude the Chinese company Huawei from its incipient 5G networks. The UK had what I regard as a perfectly coherent and technologically workable plan to allow Huawei limited participation in the edge of the 5G networks. But that was kind of steamrolled by a US administration that was determined to kind of enforce conformity. You know, and I made the point to American friends that if the US government, really does want to exercise a kind of leadership role, when it comes to Chinese technology, it is going to have to be willing to countenance a degree of variable geometry that it won't find easy or comfortable to deal with. Ordering allies and other potentially friendly countries to cut off dealings with China may simply not be realistic. Every country has its own relationship with China. Every country has its own needs in relation to China, and the idea that one can impose any kind of uniform approach in this context, I think is unrealistic. So I think that I would argue that if the US wants to be successful in this arena, it is going to have to accept the reality that in some areas Chinese technology will likely predominate globally, and we will need to live with that. And people like Eric Schmidt in Silicon Valley, who co-authored a recent report on the subject, argue exactly that. There are some situations where we're going to end up using Chinese technology. Guys, get over it. Learn to live with it and mitigate the associated risks. And so when it comes to Japan and Korea, both in their own way strong US allies, but not as between themselves perhaps the closest of friends, shall we say. Managing this is going to be extremely difficult for precisely these reasons. I mean, Japan is itself becoming more concerned about China's rise and is increasing its efforts to hedge against an increasingly dominant and regionally and globally powerful China. But at the same time, Japanese government has to contend with a population that still has very strongly pacifist inclinations, does not want to go down the route of a more antagonistic relationship with China. Managing that is going to be very difficult. Of course, for Japan, bizarrely, for all that it is one of the world's most advanced industrial economies, there's been something of a laggard when it comes to information and communications technology. The internet, they've been very, very slow in adopting the internet and all the technologies related to it, relative to many other countries. South Korea, on the other hand, has become an advanced, a producer of some of the key inputs to advanced technologies, in particular, the very advanced microprocessors that are key to a lot of advanced technical and industrial applications. I mean, it is a bizarre situation where these capabilities, I'm talking about the production of microprocessors in the sort of 11 through to 5 nanometer production mode, are concentrated in two places, Taiwan and South Korea. Both countries, shall we say, not exactly far away from the epicenter of geopolitical tensions.
My question is, it's interesting that you mentioned Russia as the major disruptor, because
Mm.
the interim national security strategy of the U.S., which was released a month
Mm.
ago, also called Russia a major disruptor in world
Mm.
stage. So,
Yeah.
where do you in technology competition? Where do you put Russia?
Yeah.
This is
Well, I
now
mean,
one of the
obviously,
most significant questions in geopolitics as well. How
yeah.
about in technological competition?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that, obviously Russia, is in many senses, it has to be considered a major cyber power. But in contrast to China, Russia has never, succeeded in commercializing its expertise. I mean, nobody's going to buy, a Russian designed operating system, or a Russian-made computer. And Russia's own networks are actually surprisingly weak and vulnerable. But where we do see is that a lot of the world's malware does originate in Russia. I've seen figures estimating that it's as high as 80% of the total. And if we look at Russia's activities in the cyber domain, what we see is, in large measure, disruptive operations, whether espionage, whether sabotage, whether influence operations designed to destabilize states, and that is where the focus lies. In Russia we see a coexistence, a symbiosis between organized criminal groups and the state, in which these criminal groups are given leeway to operate, provided they don't operate within Russia, and provided also that they make their capabilities available to the state as and when required. So, and from a geostrategic perspective, Russia is a country that has come to see its own security as a function of everybody else's insecurity. And to that extent, the more that it can keep major competitors and adversaries off balance, the safer it feels. And this is where we see, so much of Russian activities being focused.
Nigel,
but Russia is never going to shape the international agenda in terms of technical standards in the way that China aspires to do and quite plausibly might.
Nigel, in your previous experience, how did you assess the cyber attacks, the threat of cyber attacks? Were they extremely dangerous, especially the two cyber attacks in the last couple of months in the United States generated a lot of reaction by the US administration by the multiple times talk about the SolarWinds, the Russian-based cyber attack to the US, and another one, I think, based on China. How dangerous were these for the national security of the US and Western countries?
Well, I mean, obviously, these were very significant attacks, but I think, again, we need to get them in context. SolarWinds was essentially an intelligence gathering operation. It wasn't designed to carry out sabotage. It wasn't, a covert influence operation. It was there to collect intelligence, and it was, targeted against what one might term traditional national security targets. So, by my standards, it was, within the realms of what has to be considered acceptable, given that everybody does this. Again, the scope and scale of it was different, went further perhaps than the originators had intended. And the full extent of the damage caused by SolarWinds, I think, is still to be determined, because we're talking here about a security operating system which is widely used by a lot of major players in the United States. and particularly when it comes to private sector actors, I think it's still unclear how extensive the damage is. The Microsoft attack, again, was yes, clearly very damaging. It exploited known vulnerabilities in Microsoft operating system. And again, the damage from that attack has yet, I think, to be fully assessed. So these attacks are potentially worrying, perhaps less because of the actual damage they do than because of the perceptions that they create, and the risk. A lot of these activities can be lumped together in what is variously referred to as gray zone activities, or activities that fall beneath the threshold of the law of armed conflict. But with these activities always comes the risk that the perpetrator may inadvertently cross an adversary's red line without realizing they've done so, and hence inviting an escalatory retaliation. And I think activities on this scale bring us closer to that point. And so I do feel that the time has come for states to start thinking, to start reassessing the utility of some of these activities, because I would argue there is a growing risk that they may well end up creating more problems for the perpetrators than they had anticipated or would have been willing to risk.
Thank you very much. Nigel, we have a lot of questions, but we are out of time. So it has been now more than an hour. And apologies for those who ask different questions that I couldn't ask. Thank you for your time, Nigel. And again, congratulations for this great book. And hope to see you again in our events. And thanks for the audience for following us. See you in next book talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.